Hello, friends. I've been wondering about something recently. Well, actually, I've been wondering about it for a long time. The older I get, the less interested I become in asking who's right, and the more interested I become in asking, what kind of person is this belief helping me become? That question has quietly been rearranging my life over the last couple of years because I've started noticing something pretty fascinating. Two people can genuinely care about another human being and yet be caring from two completely different places. From the outside, they can look almost identical. Both are kind, both are sincere, both may even use the very same words. I'm worried about them, my heart breaks for them, I just want what's best for them. But underneath those words, something very different can be happening. One person's compassion might begin with a conclusion. I already know what's wrong. I know what they need. If only they believed what I believe. Another person's compassion might begin with curiosity. I wonder what they've carried. I wonder why they feel this way. I wonder what their story has been. Both people may genuinely ache. Both may genuinely care. But one begins by trying to change the person standing in front of them. The other begins by trying to understand them. And lately, I've been noticing that those two ways of seeing another human being feel completely different in my body. One feels tight, urgent, like I have to fix something. The other feels spacious, curious, like I can simply be with another person long enough to hear their story. Because psychologists have taught us something remarkable. Long before we consciously evaluate any situation, our nervous system is already asking, am I safe? It's constantly scanning, constantly interpreting, constantly trying to protect us. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. It's one of the main reasons our ancestors survived. But it also made me wonder, what happens when our nervous system believes someone we love, or anyone for that matter, is facing the greatest danger imaginable? If I genuinely believe another person's eternal future hangs in the balance, of course I'll feel urgency. Of course I'll worry. Of course my attention will keep returning to what I think they need to believe. That concern can be deeply sincere. I never question that. I understand it. I lived inside it. But then another thought keeps floating by. If I'm carrying that existential concern, not only for myself, but for my children, my spouse, my family, my neighbors, my community, and ultimately every human being I meet, that's an astonishing amount of weight for one nervous system to carry. We live on a planet of more than 8 billion people. Even if my concern is sincere, my body has no way of carrying 8 billion lives. No wonder so many of us feel exhausted. No wonder so many nervous systems remain in a constant state of vigilance. Modern psychology continues to show us that when our brains perceive ongoing threat, our stress response can remain activated for long periods of time. So over time, that can affect our sleep, our immune system, our relationships, and our overall well-being. Which made me continue to wonder, what if love was never asking us to carry the weight of the whole world, but simply to become more present with a small corner of it we've actually been entrusted to love? What if the invitation was never to become an expert in anyone else's soul, but a devoted gardener of our own? Because here's something I don't think we talk about very often. Human beings are remarkably sensitive. We can oftentimes quite easily sense when someone is genuinely trying to understand us, but we can also very often sense when someone has already decided who we are. Nobody has to say it out loud. Bodies notice, nervous systems notice, facial expressions shift, conversation changes, there's a subtle tightening, and a wall quietly begins to rise. Not because anyone intended to build one, but because judgment, even well-intended judgment, rarely gives us those home vibes. And that's where another question pops up for me. I've started wondering if one of the greatest dangers isn't even disagreement, but certainty. Not the quiet confidence that comes from lived experience, the kind of certainty that no longer needs curiosity, the kind that no longer asks questions, the kind that mistakes the map for the landscape itself. History is filled with moments when human beings became absolutely certain. Sometimes that certainty did inspire extraordinary acts of courage and compassion, but sometimes it justified some of the most atrocious acts against humanity that perpetuated incredible harm for future generations. The issue wasn't conviction. The issue was whether conviction remained teachable, whether it could still sit in wonder, whether it could still listen. Lately, I've been watching conversations about education, about history, science, sacred texts, what belongs in classrooms, what children should learn. And I keep coming back to the same question. What kind of learners are we hoping to raise? Children who simply know what to think? Or children who know how to wonder, to explore, to dive deep? Curiosity isn't the enemy of faith, or science, or wisdom. Curiosity is often how all three can even continue to grow. Sometimes I picture certainty like the thorn hedge around Sleeping Beauty's castle. And just as a little side note, I'm actually thinking of the older versions of the story here. In Disney's version, Maleficent creates the Wall of Thorns, which is a really interesting shift in the story. In many of the older tellings, the hedge isn't primarily an act of evil. It's there to protect the Sleeping Kingdom, to keep the princess hidden until the time is right. But in Disney's version, the danger comes from an external villain. And I found myself wondering if that's also an interesting shift in how we sometimes understand ourselves. Because in my own experience, the thickest walls I've encountered weren't usually built by an evil other. They were built by fear, by self-preservation, by human beings trying to protect what felt really vulnerable. And sometimes our beliefs become those thorns. Not because we're malicious, but because we're afraid. We build them because something inside us feels too tender, too vulnerable to leave unguarded. The tragedy isn't that we build walls. The tragedy is when we forget they were meant to protect us for a season and begin believing they were meant to separate us forever. Eventually, the hedge becomes so thick, nothing new can enter. Not relationship, not wonder, not curiosity. Protection quietly becomes isolation. And maybe that's one of the saddest things fear can do. Not because fear is evil. Fear has helped humanity survive for thousands of years. But when fear quietly becomes the architect of our relationships, we begin building fortresses where I think we were hoping to build homes. These days, I find myself asking different questions. Not what's wrong with this person, but what has this person carried? What did they inherit? What happened before I entered their story? The more I learn about psychology, trauma, attachment, history, and the human nervous system, the harder it becomes to reduce a person to a label. Instead, I begin seeing adaptations, protective strategies, generational echoes, not excuses, context. And context has this beautiful way of making compassion possible without removing responsibility. It's almost impossible to stay deeply curious and deeply contemptuous at the same time. Curiosity just allows something to soften, not because it removes conviction, because it reminds me that every person I meet is carrying a story I'll never fully know. Maybe becoming is something we never actually finish. Every season invites us to see a little farther, to soften a little more, to become just a little more curious, maybe a little bit more compassionate. So maybe this week, instead of asking, whose fault is this? Or who needs to change? Maybe we could simply become curious enough to ask, what story might I not know yet? What assumptions am I carrying? And what kind of person are those assumptions helping me become? Because perhaps one of the quietest dangers isn't believing something deeply. It's believing we've reached the end of the conversation. It's taking something outside of ourselves, whether that's a sacred text, a political ideology, scientific theory, a family tradition, or even our own past experiences, and allowing it to become a conclusion instead of the beginning of a conversation. Maybe wisdom isn't found in having fewer questions. Maybe wisdom is found in becoming the kind of person who never loses the courage to ask better ones. I have a small yet growing feeling that communities built on curiosity, humility, and compassion will always build stronger bridges than communities built on certainty alone. Because bridges don't ask us to become the same. They simply make relationship possible. And maybe that's where true belonging begins to take root. Thank you for pulling up a chair around the campfire. Until next time, be curious, be creative, be compassionate. I love you.